Hi there. I'm here with Leona Christy of Catalyst Ed and Beth Rabbit of the Learning Accelerator. Thank you both for joining us today.
Of course. Hi,
Great to be
Tyler.
here.
To get started, I wondered if you could tell us, for those who may not be familiar, could you give us a quick background on Catalyst Ed and the Learning Accelerator?
Was happy to. So, Catalyst Head works with schools, systems, and nonprofits to help them become more effective, more equitable, and become more resilient. And we do this essentially so that they can serve the students, families, and communities that they work with much better, especially those from marginalized communities. The way our model works is that we help education leaders and teams get really smart about what kinds of capacity they need to build. And then we connect them to vetted specialists across the country. And then we also give them the information and insights they need to make good choices about whom to work with on what kinds of problems. At a more systemic level, we are strengthening the provider ecosystem, so all the folks who provide expertise to school systems and nonprofits, as well as aggregating data and insights from hundreds and thousands of projects so that we're all getting smarter about what works under what kinds of contexts.
What about the Learning Accelerator?
Yeah. So the Learning Accelerator, also known as TLA to some, is a national nonprofit that's trying to build a better K-12 education sector. So we work across the education field to help practitioners, policymakers, technologists, other decision makers to share information and learn faster together and work collectively to tackle really big problems. So a little bit like Catalyst Ed, we work at the ecosystem level. We're trying to build a K-12 sector that's actually capable of learning in the same way we hope we are producing schools and systems where kids are learning. And we accelerate individual, organizational, and sector level, progress. We are working towards a future in which every kid gets what they need to reach their full and unique potential. And we've been doing that for about a decade.
Wonderful. Thank you. So, we hear a lot in conversations we have with our partners and just organizations involved in education, ed tech. A common idea, and you both mentioned it, is this idea of inequality, lack of inclusivity for each learner, for every learner in the K-12 environment. And, some of those are systemic and they're inherent and they're historical. But in your minds, how are nonprofits and ed tech vendors, how do they unfortunately contribute to the enabling conditions of inequality in K-12 education?
I'll start. There's a lot to say here. The first thing I'll say is that as it relates to really like helping every learner, for us, we envision a future where learning is personalized to who kids are, their strengths, their needs, their context, their communities, their identities. Learning that is focused on mastery, not just time in school, and learning that's holistically developing. Our academic achievement is not just a function of our reading instruction, but actually like our whole development as a human being. And so the thing that we see from our national perspective is actually one, there's never been more agreement about how education needs to look more that way, particularly for our kids who have learning and processing differences, who may bring divergence to the classroom around need. And there's amazing innovation that is happening at the level of the classroom all the way up to the sector. But we are not figuring out how to connect that innovation and make it apparent and open in the ways that it needs to actually help every kid in this country. Our resources are incredibly fragmented. We aren't sharing information or on like what we're aiming for or where we all are working and how. We have a lot of single point solutionitis rather than comprehensive change focus. And oftentimes we're competing rather than collaborating.
Sure.
And I actually think from my perspective from TLA that those are the things that are actually sucking resources from our system and keeping us from being the sector that's actually capable of delivering on that vision. Obviously, as you said, our kids bring an enormous amount of background, opportunity, but also like systematized injustice and inequity to classrooms. I believe, though, it's entirely possible with the amazing number of organizations and people who are working on these problems to do a whole lot better than we're doing now.
I'm going to just pick up from where Beth left off. And the question that's come up for me is, if there are so many amazing organizations, why do they find it so hard to address a problem that at least intentionally we all seem aligned towards solving, right?
Sure, yeah.
And I think a big part of it is because we do live in a deeply inequitable society. And so organizations, leaders, teams have to actively do things to change the status quo. You can't just repeat the same practices that were always there, that, like Beth said, were designed for students who fit a really narrow mold, and expect that that's going to change, decades, centuries of deeply inequitable patterns, right?
Sure.
And so I think the opportunity here is for organizations and leaders to say, how can we change who has access to really excellent instructional resources? How can we change who has voice in terms of how they shape these systems and solutions, right? How can we change how resources are allocated so that students, especially those from historically marginalized communities, if anything, get disproportionate access to resources rather than less, which is how it is right now. And then, of course, how do we ensure that students see themselves reflected in the systems and institutions that serve them, right? So these are all the things that we need to work at multiple levels and multiple levers in order to resolve something that's been around for so long.
Sure. Yeah. It's interesting, Beth, you mentioned that this tendency for competition. And maybe that's something that comes naturally.
It shows up pretty much endemically in every single decision nonprofit and technology leaders have to make, right? We need resources to be able to do our work.
Yeah.
But the system in which we're working has very few incentives for us to work the way we should work.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering, because you think about the ed tech vendor perspective, and there's obviously a profit motive there, but then there's this whole other section which is literally called nonprofit. Well, what are the competitive incentives there?
I think it's really interesting because I think the nonprofit sector is in sort of a battle for our soul right now, right? We exist because the for-profit sector is not capable of pursuing like the bottom lines that we pursue, and because the public sector is not delivering, right? But oftentimes as leaders, we're held up to the strategies that have been developed in either of those sectors or the resourcing streams that have been developed as the pathway to sustainability. And I think that one of the things I think a lot right now as a leader is like, how do I challenge some of those default assumptions around how we operate?
Sure.
And, what are the ways that I can take risk as a nonprofit leader in terms of collaborating with awesome organizations where if I had a for-profit board, they'd be like, why are you sharing resources in this way? But where I can also push at the public systems that are so stable. I think that we have, for better, for worse, a moment in time where we have fewer resources available. There's a lot of urgency coming out of the pandemic to address what appear to be pandemic related, but actually are like systemic inefficiencies and inequities that have existed forever. And we're going to do so at a moment where, candidly, the philanthropic sector is pretty disorganized, and we're facing fewer public resources that will be coming to public ed. That, for me, is a clarion call for those of us who are sitting in these nonprofit seats. And what I would also say, vendor seats, to really think about how we're working. I was recently talking with someone who said, like, no one pays you to change the system. And I think that's pretty true. And I think that what we tend to see is in trying to pursue resources, we may end up in places we don't want to be. Leona?
No, I'm plus wanting to everything that Beth said here. The reality is resources are a constraint to some extent, right? So the scarcity mindset isn't something that's come out of nowhere. When you look at how many the level of resources that a for-profit company similar to Catalyst Ed, for instance, would get with how much we would get. There is a massive differential there, right? So there is the scarcity of resources and the incentives that then creates is real.
Mhm.
That said, the point that Beth is making about how we as organizations are cultured to address that kind of limited resource is absolutely fair. Rather than thinking about, if we have limited resources, how might we use them well and how might we collaborate in order to ensure that they go further? We are very much of the mind of saying, how can I get the most out of this limited pie?
Sure.
Right. And then I think the other thing I'll add here is, while one currency here is actual dollars, another big part of the currency in the sector is recognition.
Sure.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Right. And credibility. And very often the competition isn't just for resources. It is to be seen as the most innovative, as the most expert, as the one who's moving the conversation the furthest, the fastest. So there is a fair amount of hoarding of ideas
Yeah. These are
that
limited
happens
resources
as a
as
result,
well. Yeah.
even though the reality is all of our ideas kind of build off each other, right?
Mhm.
And then when you add on to this, the fact that that limited amount of resource, the recognition that people crave, all of that flows differentially depending on who you are, right? So mainstream organizations, white male leaders who fit a certain mold are much more likely to get access to disproportionate resources
Sure.
of all kinds,
Yeah.
as compared to women entrepreneurs or people of color. So you put in all of those things together, and you have this pretty weird dynamic where we all really want to work with each other at one level, but also feel like that, like, again, similar to the whole equity question, we need to actually swim against the flow in order to make that happen.
This is the innovation challenge, right? We increasingly at TLA organize networks and people around challenges to equity. And I think for our sector, our innovation challenge is, how do we work differently with the same levels of resources that we have to produce much better outcomes?
Mm.
To make a connection to what we're talking about for learners, we're stuck in very similar mindsets in our schools and classrooms. We say, well, so I have a daughter who is neurodivergent. I also identify as neurodivergent, and we've been trying to figure out how to get her reading support. And the school's response is, we have so many kids with this need. Here's the piece of the pie that we can allocate
Sure.
for this one-on-one time. And I would argue it's that type of thinking that is happening at the level of classroom all the way up to the sector that keeps us repeatedly making the same mistakes and not being able to pursue bigger change. What would it look like for us to change how schools operate, to have multi-teacher classrooms, to break up our physical spaces, to be willing to play with time, to use technology, to ensure every kid got what they needed, and that educators in schools could access the knowledge openly and the tools openly to do that in ways that don't mean, like, if you're at one school, you get one thing, and another school, you get another. And I think as sector level, entrepreneurs, Leona and I see the same thing happening at multiple levels up to where we are, which is like the innovation challenge is, how do we work collaboratively to do a whole lot more differently and actually show the value of what our sector could be if we were willing to challenge some of the market norms.
Sure. Yeah. You got into what was going to be my next question, which was, Leona, you mentioned the inequities that arise. I think for most people, most obviously in the areas of sex and race.
Okay.
I wonder, and you touched on this, Beth, is that this also affects folks with learning disabilities. We're all in the education field. My question is, in what ways does this impact students with learning disabilities, these inequities, these structural inequities? And, what are the Learning Accelerator and Catalyst Ed doing to address that inequity?
Yeah. So, as a sector, we keep talking about how diversity is a strength.
Sure.
Right. But diversity is a strength only when you have equitable access, voice, representation, resources, etc.
Mm.
Otherwise, it's a winner takes all kind of situation, right? And so if you look at our classrooms, look at how learning happens, you look at how the sector is structured for that matter, it's all geared towards a very narrowly defined norm. And if you fit that norm, then great. If you're not, then you're really left to fend for yourself,
Sure.
right? And that's where you have families who have to self-advocate, who are trying to develop their own solutions and approaches. The tragedy is that the system actually doesn't serve anyone, because the number of students who fit that really narrowly defined norm is very, very small.
Yeah.
Right. And so there is this huge opportunity, as Beth said, to just scramble everything and reconfigure it. Right. And reconfigure it not through one all-knowing entity that says, here's what school needs to look like, because the reality is that singularly defined school will just fit another set of kids. And there'll be another set of kids who are then left behind, right? And so the opportunity here is to allow students and families to have much more of a say in how their educational experiences are designed and delivered for them, right? For us at Catalyst Ed, a big part of how we think about our role in this work is education systems, whether that's school districts, nonprofits, schools. They have just been used to doing things in a certain way for decades now. They don't necessarily have the skills, the expertise, the knowledge, the culture, the resources, the things that are necessary for them to make this big change. Part of it is a knowledge gap. Part of it is a courage gap. And so this is where what we are doing through our work is helping those leaders and teams that are, that intend to make that change and take that first step, helping them really figure out what does it look like for them to actually change how they deliver all of this, right? And change their whole way of operation in many ways. And then connecting them up to the resources, to the capacity, to the people who can help them in that journey. And then taking a step back, learning from the experiences of each of these, entities that's trying its own little micro experiment to say, what are we learning from all of this? And sharing it with entities like TLA that can then use those insights to guide a sector-wide conversation about what needs to change and how.
Sure.
Yeah, Leona just hit on so much. I mean, to speak to TLA's work on some of this, so obviously we believe the most important thing is to actually hold and commit to a truly learner-centered vision for the future of education. From the perspective of a system, it's really easy to say, okay, how do we meet as many kids' needs as bluntly as possible? And to use that as the trajectory for improvement and innovation. If we say, for whom in our system are we actually not experiencing any success, or we might be causing damage? How do we design for those kids from the beginning and assume every learner that's going to benefit them? That's an important thing for us to just ground from. The second thing, and Leona alluded to this, our organization believes that knowledge hoarding is a form of injustice. And for that reason, we really think it's critically important that the education sector actually figure out how to start sharing information openly about the practices that are working, about the practices that are not working, particularly as they relate to innovation. Because a lot of times we might pursue an innovation without understanding a really big equity implication. One example I would give is for our learners who are learning English in the classroom. Very early on, about 10 years ago in the blended learning movement, everyone said, awesome, put those kids on Duolingo, give them this technology so they can access the knowledge at their own pace in their own language. That deprived those kids of an inclusive access to academic discourse and engagement with their peers. That was an early lesson that we learned that we keep seeing show up again and again and again, because we as a sector are not committed to open sharing of knowledge in order to get better. So TLA does a ton of open licensing and knowledge capture to unlock the great ideas and the lessons from those silos. The last thing I think is like we have to create spaces and networks for people to tackle this work collectively and
Sure.
openly as they do it.
We've talked a lot about the complexity of these inequity issues, and I guess to wrap up, part of the Educating All Learners Alliance primary work is this idea of creating a pathway to possible. And so I wonder, given the complexity of all of this, is there an actionable insight or action to take in this space, whether someone is an educator, works in a nonprofit, works for an ed tech vendor? What's a step that they can take from this conversation in order to create that more equitable path to the future?
So one thing that's coming to mind for me, which might feel a little meta, but I think is important, is we as practitioners, policymakers, decision makers have to recognize when we're facing a singular problem that has a technical solution, or in fact a mess, which is a systems of problems. And I think as we think about particularly serving our learners who are furthest from opportunity, including those with learning differences, we have to be willing to confront the system and the set of problems rather than just throwing point solutions. I think that particularly at a conference like South by Southwest, where we have a lot of innovative, awesome technology companies, really being able to evaluate like the solutions within the context of our systems and thinking through what are the like equity challenges that are going to arise from adoption here, and keeping those forefront is really important. And it's more of a mindset challenge than a super practical one. But I think if we held that more often, we'd solve our problems more quickly.
It makes sense.
Yeah. I love the whole educating all learners part of this. And I think we often think of learners only as the students, and we forget that the educators, the school leaders, the systems leaders, they all need to be learners as well, especially because this work is so different from anything that they've done before, right? And so I think all of us, because I implicate myself in this as well, we need to commit to learning as well, right?
Sure.
Learning from each other, learning about ourselves, learning about the students that we work with, right? So that's one thing. And then I'm going to just add in a second thing there.
Sure.
Because that kind of learning is always hard. It's not like you can just, memorize a 10-step list of things and suddenly learn what it's all about. I do think there is an opportunity here to bring in people and voices from those communities being served, right? Because they don't need to attend a class to learn what it is like to be a student of color or a student with learning differences.
Right.
It's a lifetime of experiences that they bring to the role, right? And so I think this is an opportunity for us to say, how do we not just learn ourselves, but also bring in more people, create more space at the table for folks who may already have that kind of knowledge and experiences through a lifetime of their own experiences as well.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. I appreciate the time, Beth, Leona. This was a great conversation. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, Tyler.
Thanks for having us.